What's going on, YouTube? Listen up, young elder gang. This is Rabbi Dawit Ahmed, back at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video, fam. I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes. In this video, you will find history, definitions, scripture, information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning, the truth. Keep in mind this content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational, and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth as we best understand it today. Be sure to hit that like button, young elder gang. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Hit that bell, and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. In the year 1959, almost 90% of the white population had abandoned Woodlawn, leaving extreme blight and abandonment of businesses and properties. Black street gangs from the more upper South Side, like the Devil's Disciples and Egyptian Cobras of the South Side, settled in Woodlawn to offer protection to the black community as crime was growing, and the Chicago police were brutal toward this new black community. However, within no time, Cobras and Disciples began feuding with each other, and in East Woodlawn, the Cobras dominated. The Vice Lords were a rising organization from the West Side in 1959, and one of the founders had family on the South Side of Chicago, particularly in Woodlawn. Leonard "Cal" Calloway was one of the first 7 Vice Lords that helped put it all together, and before he was a Vice Lord, he was an imperial chaplain. Cal was related to 15-year-old Eugene "Lil Bruce" Hairston. Hairston was no gangbanger before 1959 and was not even a native of Chicago. Hairston was born on May 1st, 1944, and was raised in Columbus, Ohio in his younger years, before his family moved to Chicago in 1955. The Hairston family first moved to the low end, east side of Washington Park and south side of Grand Boulevard, runs north-south between Cottage Grove, State Street and east-west from around 55th/47th towards Roosevelt. In 1956, the Hairstons relocated to Woodlawn, I think, over by Stony Island Avenue. Hairston connected with neighborhood pimps, hustlers, drug peddlers and gamblers when he moved to Woodlawn, which got him his charisma and his ability to hustle on the side. In turn, he gained a lot of respect in the neighborhood, and so began his nickname as Bull that would morph later into King Bull. The Hairston family was from a more middle-class cut, however. They still bonded with the Fort family from 6536 Blackstone Avenue, 65th Place and Blackstone. The Forts were a little different as they were from the African-American Southern migration hailing from Aberdeen, Mississippi. Hairston's family, I believe, was more middle-class, but John and Annie Fort were cotton pickers. The Forts first lived in the near South Side community by 22nd and Cottage Grove. This part of Cottage Grove was removed long ago, in 1955, until they had to relocate to Woodlawn in 1956 due to construction in the area that effectively removed Cottage Grove Ave from 22nd down to 33rd Street. Both families seem to have relocated to Woodlawn in the same year of 1956, and they bonded since. It was through this bond that Eugene Hairston and little Jeff Fort became friends. As the boys became friends, Jeff Fort was introduced to Cal. Jeff Fort was born on February 20th, 1947, and was 3 years younger than Bull, so he was sort of in Bull's shadow in the early years. In the later 1950s, Jeff had behavioral problems and would often get in trouble at school and at home. Sometimes Jeff would run away to the west side and stay over by Cal, and this is when Jeff got to personally witness the rise of the Vice Lords and how Cal and the others were plotting a strategy for taking over North Lawndale. This is how Jeff and Eugene learned how to be conquerors and gang leaders from the original Vice Lords. They also learned how to draw up a constitution and create bylaws for the organization to follow and how to set and enforce rules. The almighty Black Pea Stone Nation Moore Williams. In November of 1959, Jeff Fort assembled the Blackstone Rangers, and this is how it all began. In the beginning, Rangers were said to be thieves that stole purses and broke into stores in the neighborhood. These boys also fought battles with the much larger Egyptian Cobras. Jeff and his family lived at the corner of 65th Place and Blackstone at 6536 Blackstone Avenue. Therefore, he made 64th Street down to 66th Street along Blackstone Avenue the turf of the Rangers. Eugene Hairston started his own gang at the same time he called the Harper's Boys, that was named after the street they formed on, which was between 63rd and 64th and Harper. The Harper's boys were the same size as the Rangers, with about a dozen guys, and they claimed Jackson Park was all theirs as they guarded between 63rd down the 67th along Stony Island Ave. Even though Fort and Hairston and their families had been friends for the past 4 years, and they both were inspired by the Vice Lords, once they broke off to start their own gangs, they became bitter rivals. Not only did each of their gangs fight the Egyptian Cobras and the Devil's Disciples north and west of them, they also fought each other tooth and nail, which led to the shooting of Carl Robinson. The Rangers shot Carl with a zip gun, and now the Harper's boys were furious and the rivalry became worse. The two gangs would fight each other for dominance, but there was no winner. Jeff Fort's group gained more notoriety in the community as Blackstone Rangers were reported more often and watched by authorities as opposed to the Harper's boys that were often just referred to being members of the Rangers, the almighty Black P. Stone Nation Moore Williams. In the year 1960, Jeff Fort went on a conquest to conquer the intersection of 63rd and Stony Island, which he wanted to call the Enchanted City. It was a bad area of the neighborhood, with prostitutes standing on the corner night and day. Fort thought he could interact with the people here and dominate this corner to make rules of conduct for everyone, kind of like a socially engineered society. He felt he could help keep the community safer by controlling the criminal groups. As he tried to take this corner, he ran into too many wars with the Harper's boys and other gangs, therefore it couldn't happen. Brune and Ulyssella, J.R., November 1988, the making of Jeff Fort. In the year 1960, Jeff Fort and Eugene Hairston realized they couldn't defeat each other. Therefore, they combined forces as one organization. Eugene Hairston did not like the name Blackstone Ranger, but because it was the recognized name on the streets and the Harper's boys' name was not so much, Hairston reluctantly accepted the name, the almighty Black P. Stone Nation Moore Williams. In 1960, Hairston wasn't nominated by the Rangers as the chief, nor did he take it upon himself. He was appointed by a higher power in the neighborhood. Hairston always had connections with small adult African-American syndicate groups in the area, and he was mentored by them and did favors for them. Now that the syndicates wanted to work directly with Hairston's gang, the syndicates saw how the Rangers could be vicious and how they had incredible influence on the streets of Woodlawn. Therefore, they saw opportunity. These syndicates were neighborhood drug dealers, pimps, illegal gambling operators, and worked as fences. They even had their hands in the policy racket. The syndicates had plans for these boys and were willing to pay them money to be drug couriers, collect extortion payments, or even kill for them if needed. If a contracted killing needed to be done, these syndicates would hire the boys to carry out the hit. Not only would the boys get paid for doing these acts, the syndicates mentored them and helped them grow to recruit many more young boys under the age of 17 so that they could carry out illegal activities without facing serious jail time that adults would have to face. The syndicates were also the ones that appointed Eugene Hairston as the head of the Blackstone Rangers, giving him the title of Big Chief. They loved his charisma and the incredible respect he got on the streets. Hairston was also tough as nails. The syndicates appointed Jeff Fort as Little Chief, and he was to be the one to recruit because he could get so many youths to follow him, and he was highly charismatic. Most boys would work as drug couriers, numbers runners, and even lookouts, and the syndicates loved it because they could pay them next to nothing to do these dirty and dangerous jobs. Most times they were paid just a few coins, and of course the best part, the older guys didn't do jail time. The syndicates even installed a no-snitching policy and scared them into not snitching with threats when caught. Eugene Hairston had the ability to relate to leaders of other gangs in the neighborhood, and he could convince them to take their whole gang and join the Rangers, and this is when the Rangers really started to grow in 1960. The almighty Black P. Stone Nation Moore Williams. Once the nation was created in 1960, Eugene Hairston, Lamar Bop Daddy Bell, Charles Ryko Cranshaw, and other former Harper's boys created the Main 21 ruling body, which became a set of bylaws and a constitution the Rangers had to live by. The template for the bylaws came from the Vice Lords, who were declared their first cousins, mainly due to actual family ties. Rangers were more about black power than Vice Lords originally were, and this brought about African-rooted literature and symbols for the Rangers. The pyramid was chosen as it demonstrated their belief that ancient Egypt was the first civilization, and since it is an African country, it shows how Africans were first to walk the earth and the first civilized society in Egypt. It also represents symbolism of their African ancestors and their divinity. The four corners of the pyramid are four 90-degree angles that add up to 360 degrees, hence how the 360 degrees was created. Each side of the pyramid had its own meaning, representing earth, fire, air, and water. The pyramid was given 21 bricks to symbolize the ruling main 21 body. The colors of black, green, and red were adopted as these were Pan-African colors. Main 21 does not refer to 21 members in it, but I'm not sure why the name was chosen, the almighty Black Peastone Nation, Moore Williams. The first conquest, as a unified nation outside of Woodlawn for the Rangers, was to the South Shore neighborhood in the year 1960. The Rangers spread south of 67th Street, out of the Woodlawn area, into the South Shore neighborhood, conquering an area of the neighborhood that was first being settled by African Americans around 67th Street on the north, 71st Street on the south, Stony Island on the east, and the Illinois Central Tracks on the west by Dorchester Ave. Rangers grew in popularity with newly arrived South Shore African American youths because they offered protection, especially from rival Devil's Disciples and Egyptian Cobras that had already settled the neighborhood first. This was the beginning of a long and permanent legacy of the Black P Stones in this coveted community. Over the decades, big-time Stones have bought houses and ran some of the toughest decks in the city on these streets. Much of Black P Stone leadership has called these streets home since 1960 up to present day. 1960 was also the year Blackstone Rangers would spread to the greater Grand Crossing neighborhood. This was a neighborhood that faced some of the same racial battles in the 1950s as Woodlawn, and now by 1960, Greater Grand Crossing was 85% African American and was left as a blighted and impoverished community that became highly dysfunctional. The Rangers came here to support the black community, struggling in this red-lined community. Rangers came to deal with growing crime that victimized the black community. But within no time, Rangers battled Egyptian Cobras and Devil's Disciples that were here previously. Great Grand Crossing became a permanent home to the Stones for decades to come to present day. Also, as early as 1960, the Rangers were receiving assistance from the Woodlawn Lutheran Church and the Woodlawn Boys Club. These organizations needed to provide services to the Rangers because it helped inflate their budgets so they could keep getting more money. They sheltered the Rangers by giving them sanctuary so they could better organize, along with technical assistance so they could grow. This also connected the Rangers with other institutions that would give Ranger leaders credibility. This is how the Rangers were given the tools needed to become an organized group, but it also opened the door to more recruitment as the early 60s continued, the almighty Black P Stone Nation, Moore Williams. As I stated earlier, the Syndicates used the Rangers to do their dirty work by carrying out hits or committing other small crimes. All this caught up with Ranger leadership as Jeff Fort and Eugene Hairston would do some time in a juvenile detention center in 1961. This was the first time Ranger leadership was locked away, but the Rangers continued thanks to the interim leadership of Charles Bear, Edward Bay. The boys were let out in 1962. In the year 1962, the Rangers received a large boost in size when they converted the Egyptian Cobras into Blackstone Rangers as Cobra Stones. Mickey Cogwell took over this organization, which put Blackstone Rangers in the Robert Taylor projects, and this is how Black P Stones first came to Englewood, after many Cobras flipped to Stones, whether they were Cobra Stones or another Ranger faction. During the years 1962 until 1964, the Rangers experienced quite a bit of growth, multiplying into the hundreds in size and absorbing several gangs into the Rangers. But the bigger growth spurt would come in the latter half of the 1960s decade, especially when money started to flow into the organization without young Rangers needing to split heads for pennies. It was a relief when Rangers began roping in legitimate money from sympathetic organizations. There was also a cry out for help from the community after a very nasty 1964 war between Rangers and Disciples, as both gangs were growing and their territories were now very close to each other. Both groups simultaneously embarked upon a further Southside settlement conquest to combat racist reactions to blacks moving into white neighborhoods. In 1964, Jeff Fort's adult record began when he was thrown in jail for a short time for robbery. In the year 1964, the Rangers spread their influence south of 79th Street as they crossed into the Chatham, Washington Heights, Auburn, Gresham and Roseland communities. There was much racial strife in Roseland and Morgan Park as battles between whites and blacks were becoming intense. The Rangers arrived to support black youths suffering these conditions. In Chatham, the neighborhood was already majority black but suffered some of the same socio-economical issues as Greater Grand Crossing. In the Auburn-Gresham community, black migration had just begun. Larger black migration and white flight and racial tensions were building. Roseland was at the center of these racial issues. On the further south side, which was the hub of all Blackstone Rangers' further south side settlement. Most of the Rangers were concentrated in the 95th and Wentworth area in and near the Loudon Projects, which was ran by the Syndicate Rangers group. During this campaign, Rangers also settled in Washington Heights in the most eastern part of the community, as 1963 to 64 was the time when white flight accelerated and black migration increased. Racial strife soon followed. One may ask what I mean by racial strife. From speaking to many over time from these areas and similar white flight areas around the city, it can be any or all of these behaviors. Bullying in school. Many times white youths would pick on black students by calling them racial slurs or treating them as less equal. Teaching staff. Unequal treatment for black students. Oftentimes, when white and black students would conflict, or even if black students would get in trouble in other ways, black students were punished harsher. Sometimes black students were even accused of issues they were not part of. Unfair neighborhood boundaries. After restrictive covenants were banished by the Supreme Court in 1948, communities established sometimes agreed upon racial boundaries in neighborhoods where blacks could not be seen venturing into declared white areas. The problem was, in these changing neighborhoods, the boundaries were decided by the whites, and often included all the public facilities like pools, parks, shopping areas, etc., often leaving blacks no choice but to venture into these areas and face violence or taunting. Unfair police treatment. As black residents became new in white neighborhoods, they were watched by police closer, questioned by police more frequently, and questioned whenever a crime was committed without just cause. When fights between blacks and whites happened, police would not arrest the whites and often brutally arrested blacks involved. These are just some of the behaviors that black residents faced in these changing communities. This is mostly lost history because these issues were often short-lived because most whites took part in white flight rapidly and the racial issues were forgotten, especially as groups like the Rangers ended up focusing more on conflicts with the rival disciple groups. It is important to understand that the original cause was conflict between black and white, even if it was within less than a one-year duration. After the Stones migrated to Roseland, Washington Heights, Auburn, Gresham and Chatham, these communities became major strongholds for the Black Pea Stones for generations to come, as these became large outposts and permanent homes for the Stones, and it all started in 1964. In the year 1964, the Rangers went on a major recruitment drive in the south suburbs of Chicago. In the suburbs of Robbins and Ford Heights, heavy poverty had settled in as these suburbs were struggling as all-black communities, which made it very difficult to obtain state aid, causing unfair conditions and poverty. In the suburbs of Chicago Heights, Harvey and Markham blacks were facing heavy discrimination from whites in those communities, and roving white greaser gangs often attacked groups of black youths for no reason. In Chicago Heights, black families were forced to deal with heavy poverty and were confined to the east side of the village, which was the oldest area and was deteriorating and full of public housing projects. In Dixmoor and Phoenix, racial harmony was occurring as blacks were moving in. However, black youths had to deal with hostility from neighboring Harvey, especially at the Harvey and Dixmoor border, on 147th Street and the border with Phoenix on Halsted Street. The South suburban black youths needed assistance and a voice to stand up for them. Therefore, the Blackstone Rangers arrived at the 147th Street border and recruited among a group called the Black Elephants and fought side by side with them. Among the Black Elephants was 15-year-old Jerome General Jake Crowder, who had an older brother that was a Ranger. Crowder was one of the Black Elephants recruited into the Rangers, and was appointed as leader of the first suburban chapter in Dixmoor and Harvey. Crowder's group became known as the Harvey-Dixmoor Rangers. Crowder was mainly in charge of the Dixmoor Rangers, but overall, for the Harvey-Dixmoor branch, he was running it alongside 16-year-old Roger General II Bowman. Bowman was strictly in charge of the Harvey part of the Harvey-Dixmoor Rangers, and you can say he is the co-founder of the Harvey branch. It is very likely the Rangers were pivotal in taking part in the gin bottle riots in Dixmoor that summer of '64, and if not, they formed right after that happened in response to that incident. Right after the Harvey-Dixmoor Rangers were created, the Rangers colonized nearby Phoenix. Then, from there, they settled in Robbins, East Chicago Heights, Ford Heights, Chicago Heights, and Markham. In Markham, 14-year-old Willie Tompkins was appointed the leader and founder of the Markham branch. This group went by the name Kingston Green Rangers, that started in the Kingston Green subdivision, which was the subdivision that brought a major boom to the black population of the village. Soon, the Kingston Green residents were met with racial strife and angry white gangs, hence why the Rangers landed here. The Ford Heights chapter was headed up by 14-year-old Monty Powell, who arrived in the town as an active member in community services. He was the founder and the first leader of the Ford Heights Rangers. The first leader and founder of the Chicago Heights branch was Jerome Branch, who later took over leadership of Ford Heights too after Monty Powell was locked up for killing a Ford Heights police officer at the Ford Heights police station. As for Robbins, William Harper, an original Harper's boy, started this branch. This suburban conquest was the first ever conquest put together by any Chicago street gang in history, as the Black P-Stones can be credited with being the first Chicago street gang to open territory in the Chicago area suburbs since 1964. The Disciples got there at the same time, but were not as powerful or influential in these suburbs initially. During the early years between 1960 and 1965, the Rangers made money not only from small payments from the syndicates, but also from taxing drug dealers, pimps, hustlers, and gambling houses. Rangers also visited stores and taxed store owners in exchange for protection from any rival gangs or other criminals. Young Rangers often worked for adult drug dealers, moving product for a cut. Rangers leaders Eugene Hairston and Jeff Fort learned this from the older syndicates and passed it on to the boys coming up in the neighborhood as Rangers, the almighty Black P-Stone Nation, Moore, Williams. The neighborhood syndicates had learned from the Italian outfit and maintained strong connections to the mafia, and this is how the Stones were getting their first connections to major organized crime. Before the Rangers controlled the pimping and drug dealing, the market ran rampant, and outside forces controlled these rackets, which brought outsiders to come into the community and cause trouble, and even rob and steal from the community. The Rangers put a stop to this and kept the business within the neighborhood, flushing outsiders out. One of the biggest issues was when white customers would venture into the neighborhood seeking drugs and prostitutes. They would often become the victim of a crime in the area, and because that man was white, the police would come in cracking heads of many black men that had nothing to do with the crime. The Rangers wanted to put an immediate stop to this by keeping troublemaking whites out, and that meant cutting off white syndicates, pimping women, and distributing drugs in Ranger-controlled areas. A change began early in the year 1965 when Ed Woods, the extension director of the Woodlawn Chicago Boys Club, and Reverend H. Wilson Sotnack of Woodlawn Emmanuel Lutheran Church, 1359 East 64th Street at 64th and Kenwood Ave, wanted to help the boys get a fresh start in life, according to the April 1st, 1965 Chicago Tribune article. Reverend Sotnack offered his church for the Rangers to meet in 3 days a week so they could play basketball, play pool, play card games, play ping pong and checkers to keep the Rangers off the streets. Here, the Rangers organized dances and parties to raise enough money to buy a television set, turntable and amplifier for playing records. Here they were helping each other obtain jobs, and Ed Woods was working with Fort and Hairston on how to help them help each other find jobs, or he himself was helping the Rangers find employment. Source Chicago Tribune, April 1st, 1965. This was a very positive thing because many youths in the area struggled to find jobs due to a lack of employment offered in these crumbling communities. Now that the Woodlawn Boys Club and the Lutheran Church stepped up their involvement with the Rangers in 1965, Ranger membership became even more attractive for Woodlawn youths, and recruitment soon swelled. It was also in this year that Jeff Fort connected with Reverend John Fry of the First Presbyterian Church located at 6400 South Kimbark Avenue, 64th and Kimbark. Fry wanted to connect with Jeff Fort, who was always the visible leader of the Rangers since the beginning, as Hairston was more behind the scenes. Therefore, Fort was the one to talk to. Fry wanted the boys to come to the church and have meetings there so they could learn to become a community-based organization instead of being a street gang. Fry was offering the Rangers key guidance that would become pivotal with their connections with several organizations that would pay money to the Rangers to provide public services to neighborhood youths. The church became a major hangout for the Rangers as they threw wild parties in the gymnasium and even stashed several guns in the basement. Reverend Fry and other members of the clergy there said they had the intention of preventing gang wars between disciples and Rangers. However, the disciples were not taken in by the Reverend. Residents of the community, law enforcement, and even higher-up religious figures were very suspicious of this relationship and even criticized Reverend Fry for controlling the Rangers. Such an allegation he and the Rangers denied. The church worked with the Woodlawn organization, too, by operating a Head Start program that had a specialty with job training for adults. This was a prime opportunity for the Rangers to be incorporated in with the program, and this is what legitimized the Rangers and got them on the payroll funded by TOO and the church. Several Blackstone Rangers were now on the payroll and earning a salary just for attending meetings and guiding neighborhood youths with tools needed to try to obtain employment or to organize events that kept youths off the street. Now Rangers could afford bushtop fade haircuts and Converse gym shoes that were worth quite a bit of money back then. They wore khakis and white t-shirts, setting the fashion trend for the whole neighborhood. Kids in the neighborhood looked at the Rangers' styling and now wanted to become members, and the growth soon boomed going into 1966 as the Rangers started to become an empire. The almighty Black P Nation, Moore, Williams. The Rangers in 1965 had 200 members, but that number is just what was on record. There were hundreds more citywide. Beginning in 1966, major recruitment of other street gangs from neighborhoods like Englewood, West Englewood, Grand Boulevard, Douglas, near Southside, Oakland, and Kenwood began as the Stones were now spreading north. Rangers were even able to flip gangs up north in the near Northside neighborhood in the Cabrini Green projects. The Stone Nation now basically became an unofficial alliance of gangs coming together under one umbrella, as gangs within this alliance were adding to their gang's name either Ranger or Stone. Each gang still would operate independently. This was also done to keep up with the rival disciple alliance that was being built up around the city, as more gangs were going by the last name Disciple. Thanks to this confederation, the Rangers were now numbered at 1,500 members as far north as 31st Street. Even though the facts say 1,500 on record, there were thousands more. By 1966, Jeff Fort had begun to read about Islamic teachings. I'm not positive if he converted to Islam at this time, but he was for sure exploring many of the teachings by this point in time. In December of that year, Jeff Fort gave an idea to Eugene Hairston to create an official alliance of street gangs under the name Black Peace Stone or Black Prince Stone Nation. This idea delved deep into Islamic teachings, deriving from the Blackstone of Mecca that is believed by Muslims to have come from heaven to earth through Archangel Gabriel. This stone has long been part of a sacred ritual requiring the faithful to travel to the Kaaba, which is a chamber that holds the stone in the center of the Masjid al-Haram Mosque. It is Muslim belief that the black stone was received by Adam to be used at an altar of worship. Gabriel then brought the stone to Abraham to use on an altar that was to be used to sacrifice Abraham's son Ishmael. It was also said this stone was discovered by Abraham and Ishmael while looking for stones to build the Kaaba, which they used in the building's cornerstones. These teachings somehow tie into the month of December, which was the exact month Jeff Fort created the Black Peace Stone Alliance, and the name was born. The Dixmoor Rangers was just one of the 15 branches of the Rangers. There was also the 113th Street Rangers from the Roseland area. Other ranger groups were the FBI Rangers, Golden Rangers, Maniac Rangers, Imperial Rangers, Syndicate Rangers, Russian Rangers, Cossack Rangers, Gypsy Rangers, Traveling Rangers, and the Dixmoor Rangers. The gangs that adopted the last name of Stone were Cobra Stones, Gangster Stones, Apache Stones, Cherokee stones, Nova stones, rolling stones, Egyptian stones, nomad stones, pimp stones, and four corner stones. Englewood was an important turnout because the Rangers were able to take over from 69th Street down to 75th Street. Once the coalition and conversion of gangs happened in 1966, the Englewood chapter would grow larger, especially between 54th to 56th Street in the back of the Yards, Englewood and West Englewood areas. The Garfield Boulevard zone was heavily contested by the disciples all the way down between Englewood and West Englewood. The Rangers were trying to run it at disciple expense. Not only did Rangers over here battle ferociously against the disciples, they also fought white and Hispanic gangs from just over the Garfield Boulevard border. Garfield Boulevard is the dividing line between back of the Yards and both Englewood neighborhoods. The back of the Yards community was still very white back in the 1960s and the first half of the 1970s, and gangs like the Gaylords and Latin Souls fought savagely against the disciples, but now the war with Rangers heated up by 1966. It got so bad over here that Gaylords and Latin Souls considered a truce with the disciples on several occasions because of how badly the Rangers fought against them. These hard-fought battles made the Rangers a major force to be reckoned with on that Garfield Boulevard border. And in later years, this corridor gave birth to the Reubenite stones and the jet black stones. Rangers would also eventually take turf in the back of the Yards and cross that Garfield Boulevard border, taking over a good piece of 54th Street and all the way up to 51st Street. All this Englewood turf from 51st to 57th became known as Motown. Another legendary takeover was in the Oakland neighborhood at the intersection of 39th and Lake Park Place, right outside the Lake Park Meadows public housing projects, and 43rd and Indiana in the Grand Boulevard neighborhood. This is when the Rangers met Randy Rube Dillard, who ran 43rd, and Herbert Thunder Stevens, who ran 39th. In 1966, these two men took their gang into the Ranger Nation as Four Cornerstones. From here, Rangers spread very quickly into the Ida B. Wells public housing projects and the Clarence Darrow projects, especially in the 727 East 38th Street building in the Darrow homes. At first, this group was known as the Four Corners. And I wonder if this was the same Four Corners gang that started in the 1930s at 35th and Indiana that the Rangers flipped. If so, that is some very deep history. Another legendary settlement for the Rangers was in the near North Side community in the Cabrini Green public housing projects. The Rangers met with gang leader Samuel Tumac Dillard and brought him and his gang into the Ranger Nation, and this is the story of how the Stones came to Cabrini Green in 1966. Rangers also landed on the west side of Chicago in the year 1966. Rangers were in the North Lawndale area, attempting to settle this area alongside Egyptian Cobras and Vice Lords. Rangers were soon having gun battles with rivals, although I don't know exactly which gangs they were conflicting with. As far as I know, the Rangers never had permanent settlement in North Lawndale, but they did settle in nearby Austin eventually. But 1966 was the beginning of West Side Black Pea Stones regardless. I believe these were the FBI Rangers that settled out west first. The Black Pea Stone settlement of the Grand Boulevard community started a long, powerful and permanent settlement of this community that has been strong for generations up to present years. Even as Grand Boulevard has undergone renewal in recent years, the Stones will perhaps continue to remain a permanent fixture in Grand Boulevard permanently. The Rangers settled in the near Southside community in 1966 into the Harold Ickes public housing projects, making these buildings a major stronghold until the buildings were razed. Now, with a massive army of Rangers all over the south side of Chicago, the Rangers now connected with the Black nationalist movement and were present when Martin Luther King came to Chicago to march through the south side. In June, a rally was held at Soldier Field for 60,000 people to listen to Martin Luther King speak. At this event, hundreds of Rangers marched into the event waving a large flag that had a picture of a .50 caliber machine gun on it. The Rangers surrounded the upper deck of the stadium, making many people frightened. However, there was no violence at all or ill will. The Rangers were simply introducing themselves to the Black Liberation Movement and the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is what began the Rangers' connections to the Black nationalist and Black power movements. After taking SCLC non-violence workshops, the Rangers were able to march alongside Martin Luther King as he made his legendary marches into white neighborhoods that summer, the almighty Black Pea Stone Nation, Moore, Williams. Chief Bull was especially all about being a Black Power movement, and by 1966 he started encouraging Rangers to start wearing afros to show more Black pride. Hairston also opposed drugs, whether it was for personal use or for narcotics trafficking. The only vice Hairston had was smoking marijuana and drinking alcohol, but Jeff Fort didn't even smoke marijuana or use any drugs or alcohol. Heck, he didn't even use curse words. Eventually, Rangers would connect with the Black Panthers. An old tale spun mostly by law enforcement that told a story that Jeff Fort ran the Panthers out of Chicago by pointing over 100 guns at them, but this is far from the truth. The Rangers instead had common ground with the Panthers, and there was a mutual respect between the two groups, but they could not see themselves fully working together after they officially met in 1969. The Panthers viewed the Stones as too violent and not political enough, while the Stones considered the Panthers as idealists and pseudo-revolutionaries. Thus, the thought of a coalition never came to fruition, but there certainly was never any violence or even an ounce of hate or conflict between the two groups. The two groups hating each other is a myth, the almighty Black Pea Stone Nation, Moore Williams. By the end of 1966, there was major frustration building up in the Woodlawn community over the violent gang wars between Rangers and disciples over the crossing of Woodlawn Avenue, which served as the dividing line between the gangs. In December of that year, the Presbyterian Church began seeking grants from TWO to give to the Rangers so they could seek programs to minimize violence. In the spring of 1967, TWO received $927,000 from the U.S. Government Office of Equal Opportunity, known as OEO. OEO was created by President Lyndon B. Johnson to fight his war on poverty. TWO's president was Arnold Brazier, who was also a revered at the Apostolic Church of God and working with Reverend Fry, and both men worked with the Rangers. It was because of this connection that allowed TWO to disburse the money to the churches that, in turn, disbursed money to the Rangers to run the educational and job training centers. Not all the money went to the Rangers, half went to the disciples to carry out the same duties. Rangers and disciples were paid a salary to oversee youths and act as instructors in classrooms. Jeff Fort himself was paid a salary of $6,000 a year. The program was a big success as young black youths, including several Rangers, were finding employment and even attending college. This in turn kept many youths off the street and saved many lives. During the summer of 1967, Rangers successfully prevented a violent riot from occurring on the south side as they policed a very angry community and kept things cool. Ranger popularity grew as now membership was at 3,000 members on record, but there were several more thousands unaccounted for. All went well with the OEO program until November of 1967, when Jeff Fort was thrown in jail on murder charges until the following year for a murder he was later acquitted of. During his time in jail, the program became disorganized as many Rangers began engaging in fraudulent activities with the grant money. Rangers would often sign their names as attending the job training centers or education centers, then take sign-in sheets home to fill in the entries. Checks were also falsely signed for. All these actions would later fall under investigation. Without Jeff Fort, the program was without proper leadership and all over a murder case that was pushed on Fort. And it was something he didn't even do, the almighty Black Pea Stone Nation, Moore Williams. To make matters worse, Eugene Hairston was arrested and put in jail in September of 1967 for conspiracy to commit murder. He would remain in jail during his trial that continued until May of 1968. At the later part of 1967 and early part of 1968, the Rangers were left without leaders that could understand how to operate this program and could understand the consequences of fraud. Overzealous law enforcement became a major problem for the Rangers heading into 1968, as police closed in very sharply on the Presbyterian Church. Law enforcement pinned the staggering 1967 crime rate stats on the Rangers. Law enforcement also criticized the church and Revered Fry for harboring these boys and letting them store stockpiles of weapons in the church. Reverend Fry did admit there was a stash of guns in the church, but it was for the purpose of collecting the weapons so they could be off the street to keep the streets safer. The weapons were then locked in a safe. However, Rangers often did transfer guns in and out of the church. Boys would drink and party in the church, but Fry said there was nothing he could do about that, and his main mission was to just keep the Rangers off the street and away from violence, no matter what the cost. The church was then raided, and this time for the safe full of weapons. On the day they did the raid, Rangers happened to be meeting with agency representatives about employment and housing while others played basketball. The weapons were indeed secure in the safe out of harm's way, but police still raided the church, and it was said they were verbally abusive while disrupting positive programs. The almighty Black Pea Stone Nation, Moore, Williams. The police began to declare war on the Rangers heading into 1968, which resulted in several false arrests on mostly Main 21 members. Charges were dropped against Lee Jackson, Melvin Bailey, Alan Christmas, James Lofton and Leonard Singali. Illegal search and seizures, harassment, defamation of character, and even police beatings plagued the Rangers. This all led to the Rangers lawyering up thanks to Eugene Hairston's connection with Charles Kettering and the Kettering Foundation. Eugene Hairston was on trial for soliciting 4 young boys to gun down 3 drug dealers at the intersection of 61st and Dorchester. The charges stated that Eugene Hairston ordered boys aged 15 years old to carry out the assassination of these dealers because they were taking money from the neighborhood by selling drugs, according to court document. 13-year-old Dennis Jackson approached a car full of the dealers with a .45 caliber pistol and fired 6 bullets into the 3 men, 2 bullets apiece, killing Leo McClure and wounding the 2 others. Apparently, Paul Martin oversaw the hit from across the street and told the boys when to advance. Before shooting the men, Dennis Jackson said, "I hear you was messing with the chief." Source: The People versus Hairston. Hairston was convicted and sentenced 5 to 15 years. He then was sent to Statesville. Law enforcement considered this a major victory because they had been investigating the Rangers for years with allegations of adult leaders soliciting young boys to carry out hits for them. Police knew the adult members would benefit because they avoided jail time, and the boys would only be lightly punished even for crimes as heavy as murder. Earlier in the decade, the neighborhood syndicates did the same to the young Rangers, paying scraps to carry out murders because young Rangers would get light sentences. Now the Rangers were grown up and learned from this way of handling business. The young ones enthusiastically carried out the hits because it got them recognized and got them respect. The pay wasn't big, and it really wasn't all about the money. In the murder case Hairston was swept into, he paid the kids $6 in total to split and gave them a big plate of food according to court documents. Source: The People versus Hairston. During the trials, Eugene Hairston claimed his innocence and even said the money paid to the boys was for their work as an usher. Paul Martin was brought up on the same charges with the same exact evidence presented, but he was found not guilty based upon the poor evidence. But Bull was somehow convicted on that same evidence, which shows there was favoritism to convict the leader of the Rangers. It is very much possible the boys took this murder on themselves to make a name for themselves then. When trouble with the law came, they could have easily just pointed to Hairston. This type of thing always happened to gang leaders over the years. During the time both leaders were locked up, law enforcement closed in on the Rangers as a major war with the Disciples ensued until March 4th, 1968, when Disciples and Rangers came together to call a truce so they wouldn't lose their OEO money that paid them a salary of $45 a week. Starting the next day, anonymous tips supposedly poured in that the Rangers were stashing several weapons of destruction in multiple locations for the purpose of waging war against the police and the city. A meeting with a group of white communists was blown up after this group offered guns and grenades for a war against the US. The Rangers allegedly rejected the offer outright because it would be damaging to their organization, but the FBI and the papers blew it up as if the correlation was in the works. More harmful rumors circulated, and police were driving down hard on the Rangers on the streets. These rumors and investigations were false, but it became clear that law enforcement was desperate to dismantle the Rangers once and for all. 24-hour surveillance began on the Rangers as they were being made out to be a group of black nationalist terrorists, far from what they were about. What didn't help is that the feds flipped Maine 21 member George Watusi Rose, who gave lots of false information, including the story about the meeting with the white communists that never happened. Jeff Fort was released from jail in March of 1968. Fort then assumed control of the organization, as now there was lots of disorganization in the nation as branches were ready for full civil war, especially a branch known as Imperial Lovers. Fort had no choice but to do something drastic to restore order to the nation, and this is when he assumed total control and had no choice but to push out Eugene Hairston that was still standing trial. There was major pushback from Prophet Paul Martin, Eugene Hairston's most loyal follower and the spiritual leader of the nation. Martin was soon to make a major stir among the naysayers about Fort taking over and would have very likely led a rebellion against the new order. Martin was then led into an alley and shot in the back of the head 3 times in 1969. Fort now was fully in charge of an army of 5,000 known soldiers in 1968. The change of leadership was not fully accepted by the whole nation, and some groups of Stones and main 21 members outright opposed it and kept their loyalty to Eugene Hairston. Hairston did accept the second-in-command position while he was standing trial, as he was on the street for some time during his court proceedings. At the time, he was all right with being vice president. The conflict didn't begin until he went to prison. An act that helped the Black P. Stones bounce back was how they handled the threat of riots preceding the Martin Luther King assassination in April, and all through the summer of 1968. Stones successfully kept things cool once again on the streets for a second consecutive summer while the West Side burned during that day in April. Jeff Fort himself organized the Stones to maintain order, even when Stones advanced on Mount Carmel School and rocked a bus full of white students. Jeff Fort raised his arm and ordered the attackers to stop immediately, and all the Stones stopped and withdrew. Jeff then ordered his Stones to leave the school alone. After this day, there wasn't a single shooting between disciples and Stones for an entire month. Jeff Fort understood the power of non-violent protest even in these early days, and became pivotal in preventing the Stones from plunging into destructive behavior that would have made the Stones become public enemy number 1, and leading to the complete elimination of the Stones. Therefore, understanding Jeff Fort is important to Black P. Stone history. In July of 1968, Senator John McClellan of Arkansas held hearings for the investigation of Jeff Fort and the Black P. Stones about the management of that $927,431 given to 2 for the job training program in which Jeff Fort was considered center chief. Fort was cross-examined about allegations of taking the money and not using it for the intended purpose, especially since leadership continued to face charges of murder, rape, and strong-arm robbery, according to court documents. The program was intended to reform the Rangers, but instead it was viewed as ineffective as payment was taken without the committee's expected full results. Source: United States of America versus Jeff Fort. The committee had high expectations and did not understand it would take a long time for the program to have full effect. The committee was wanting instant results and did not consider enough that Jeff Fort's murder charge was vacated, and the fact that him being locked up caused the program to become misguided without leadership. Never was Eugene Hairston's murder charge looked into about the reason for the crime. Courts and the public only saw that he guided teen boys to kill 3 men, but never was it viewed that the reason for the shooting was to clear out rogue drug dealers pushing heroin onto these streets without authorization, thus causing harm to the community. Granted, the solicitation of teen boys to commit the murders indeed is a tear at moral fabric. However, in these organizations, younger members were more than willing to commit such crimes as they eagerly looked for advancement and respect, therefore were used for these crimes, or went rogue and did the crimes to be noticed without leadership backing. Without many other positive role models to look up to in such a destitute area, youths often only had hardened gang leaders to look up to as heroes, and gang leaders used this to train these youngsters on how to come up and become effective in the gang, just like how a manager of a company trains employees to one day become managers. Most times founders and overall nation leaders take no part in such crimes. It is usually lower-level leaders that would use young boys for self-interest, and not for the interest of the nation. At the hearing, the only information Jeff Fort provided was his name, and once it got to asking him his address, his counsel advised him to say no more. Fort then stood up, raised a clenched fist, and walked out. He would later face charges for this. One thing the committee didn't bring up at all was the fact that about $200,000 of the grant money was sent back to the federal government as unspent money. Not only that of the remaining over $700,000, only about 33% was actually paid to the Rangers. $1,467.79 of that was put into Jeff Fort's pocket. These were numbers largely ignored. Perhaps if these numbers were brought to light, it could be seen how much less greed came into play. Brune and Ilisilla Joyar, November 1988, the making of Jeff Fort. These organizations that funded the Rangers were all fighting each other to push money into the Rangers' pockets without giving the best guidance. Bottom line is, these organizations needed to provide money to groups like the Rangers and Disciples because it justified their budgets. Without these gangs in existence, these groups would have far more limitations. These groups thrived on the wars between Disciples and Rangers because it gave them justification to ask for more money. The sole purpose of the money was to pay these gangs to detract from gang warfare, and when violence was reduced, it was a big win. Law enforcement also benefited from the gang wars between Disciples and Rangers because it gave them more excuses to lock both organizations up and attempt to destroy their entire infrastructure. Law enforcement would even grease the wheels a little by pitting the two gangs against each other, by putting word out on the streets that one gang was about to move on another, a form of egging them on. There was actual evidence that the FBI sent letters to gang leaders giving them alleged intelligence the opposition was about to hit them, which is an obvious attempt to get both sides to destroy each other, thus allowing law enforcement to come down on both groups. Law enforcement could always get further justification afterwards, saying both groups were black nationalist groups, rising to become terrorist organizations, pointing out the violence as an example, the almighty Black Pea Stone Nation, Moore, Williams. This is why it became so pivotal for leaders of all the gangs to work tirelessly non-stop to keep up peace treaties, because leaders like Eugene Hairston, Jeff Fort and David Barksdale all knew a dirty game was being played by law enforcement and these social service agencies. The peace between Stones and Disciples was shattered on May 8, 1968, when Ellis rebel Stones attempted to assassinate Disciple leader David Barksdale after falling into a trap. The Ellis rebel Stones were the only Stone section in the western part of the Woodlawn neighborhood between 65th and 67th, and Ellis and the Disciples had always wanted them out. Chicago police came to talk to David Barksdale, and Barksdale mentioned that these Stones liked to shoot Disciples anytime Disciples got near their territory, and Barksdale wanted to prove his point to these detectives. Barksdale asked the officers to follow him down to 65th and Ellis, and once David and his known car made an appearance. Andrew McChristian, Melvin Bailey and Edward Dinkins opened fire on Barksdale's car, and detectives swarmed in right away to arrest the three shooters. Source: People vs. McChristian. The almighty Black Pea Stone Nation, Moore, Williams. 1968 was a year of big wars between Disciples and Stones in the Clarence Darrow projects. Stones were fighting to make the 727 East 38th Street building all theirs, and became fed up with Disciples hanging out near the building. One September night, as Disciples were shooting dice near the building, Stones planned the Svengali massacre. That night, Stones tucked shotguns and handguns in long coats. The Stones then got into the power source for the 727 building and cut the power, creating a spooky atmosphere. As the darkness befell the project building, a blaze of gunfire suddenly sparked through the darkness as bodies hit the ground. Stones chewed their way through a massive crowd of Disciples, gunning down 17 young men, all shot in the darkness. Housing authority guards became alert and shot it out with the Stones for a while. It was miraculous. Not a single person died, which is why this shooting only had one newspaper appearance in the Chicago Tribune on September 10, 1968. United States of America vs. Williams. The FBI liked to publish reports that Stones were anti-white and were perhaps rising up against the white man. In 1968, the FBI reported the Stones in the suburb of Harvey were assembling all black groups under the Black Pea Stone Nation in what they considered racial tensions. There were also reports Stones were gathering heavily in the suburb of Chicago Heights for the purpose of attacking the police, which proved to be false. Reports also said Stones were trying to extort money for contributions to businesses owned by singer Sammy Davis Jr. to support his businesses in the Harvey and Dixmoor communities, which was also false. the almighty Black P Stone Nation, Moore Williams. It is true that stones were being paid by Davis to protect his businesses, but there was no extortion, there was just a falling out. There were even allegations that the Stones were attempting to disrupt the Democratic National Convention on August 26th to get even with Mayor Daley for opposing further funding to OEO into the pockets of the Stones, but not a single Stone member ever showed up at the convention. Another false report, the almighty Black P Stone Nation, Moore Williams.